This is similar to a talk I gave at Trout Unlimited a couple weeks ago, a few little tweaks here and there. And I want to thank you for giving me a chance to talk more about this because it is really cool. As many of you know, while the heroic efforts have been going on in the Lake Sammamish Basin, I've been kind of lurking in the background. That's me lurking in the shadows there, interested in what's going on lower in the system, down along the Sammamish tributaries, the Sammamish itself, and some of the small streams that go into Lake Washington. And I got started being really interested in kokanee by visiting Wally out at his place. I took the class out there, and it happened to be a year when there were a whole bunch of kokanee coming through. I think we had something like 4,000 or 5,000 fish. And everywhere I looked in Ebright there were kokanee spawning. It was a cool thing. So I thought, boy, this would be a great thing to be able to have in some of these other streams in the basin, because as most of us know, there were kokanee throughout the basin. Lake Sammamish, Lake Washington, a bunch of these little tributaries had kokanee in them. And there's a really good historical record of kokanee being present. What's interesting is if you look into the historical record, you don't find much mention of larger salmon like coho and sockeye or any of those, but kokanee repeatedly get mentioned. So in almost living memory, people have seen large numbers of kokanee down in this area. So I just have a couple of quotes here. As is the case for the Lake Sammamish kokanee, Native Americans were making use of kokanee down on Lake Washington. And a lot of the people that came and settled in around Lake Forest Park and Kenmore and Bothell made note of the fact that there were lots, sometimes thousands of little red fish, as they called them even then, in some of these small tributaries. So that got me really interested. First, seeing what Wally had, and then second, realizing just don't see those where we are anymore. So the more I looked into what was known about kokanee and sockeye in the basin, the more complicated it became. It turns out to be a really complicated system. What we know for sure is that there were widespread native kokanee in the basin, like Sammamish, along the Sammamish River, like Washington. So that's not in doubt. Beginning in 1917 and then more in the 30s, there were introductions of non-native onurka or sockeye into the basin. They didn't really take off until the late 30s or so. And what really makes this whole story kind of confusing is that often populations of sockeye will leave behind some fish that don't migrate out to the ocean. So those are generally called residuals. So they're part of the sockeye population. In this case, part of the introduced sockeye population that get left behind and for all intents and purposes look like kokanee. If you talk to anglers, they call them kokanee. And we also have the added complication is, in addition to native kokanee, there's some indication there may be native sockeye, ocean-going fish that come out of Bear Creek. So there's a lot going on there. And if you find a small Nurka freshwater in Lake Washington or in the Sammamish River tributaries, it's hard to know whether is that something native, is it a residual, is it something that's descended from an introduced fish that has now become a kokanee? So that is a very interesting story. And it also is really the basis for trying to think about how restoration might happen of kokanee down in some of these streams lower in the basin. So as you guys have run across many times, there's often a distinction made between early, middle, and late run kokanee. And middle run is what the fish that run down in the lower Sammamish and Lake Washington were called. And the general view, and this is very disappointing to me as I started to look more, was that like the early run, which went extinct in the early 2000s at Issaquah Creek, the middle run was extinct. And the general view was that these fish that were showing up that looked like kokanee in Lake Washington and some of these other small streams were actually just residuals. So people had noticed that long ago, the populations that were so abundant down in Lake Washington had pretty much disappeared. Depending on who you talk to, or which stream you're talking about, they extended into at least the 30s, maybe the 60s, maybe the 90s. But that the general view is that they just weren't around anymore. So I was a little bit sad about that, but my sadness was short-lived because in 2017, I saw a whole bunch of kokanee-like fish coming up in North Creek and spawning in the Sammamish River down by Woodinville and a few other places. And what really got me interested in these was that they weren't overlapping very much with the sockeye. So the sockeye came up, did their thing. There were some little ones that were associated with those, which I took to be residuals. And then there was this late pulse, so mostly in November, of fish that came up. They were clearly freshwater only. They had spots like typical kokanee. They were spawning with each other, and they didn't really have much opportunity to even spawn with sockeye. So I was really curious about what these might be. I was calling them mystery Nurka because they could have been any number of things. They could have been just residuals that for some weird reason had a late run that year. They could have been maybe kokanee that evolved from an induced sockeye, which would be really interesting. Or maybe, and this is what I was most excited about, was the possibility they could be some of this native middle run population that was still around. And so that was in 2017. So, well, that's weird. We're seeing these fish. And there had also been some persistent stories about other times when late run kokanee had shown up, or kokanee-like fish. In fact, some of folks in the kokanee work group had run across these fish in 2011. When I talked to the groundskeepers at the University of Washington, Bothell, they had said, oh yeah, there was this year when there were kokanee everywhere. And then I was talking to Roger Tabor. He said, yeah, 2011, we had tons of kokanee all through the lower Sammamish River and many of the tributaries. So this struck me as really interesting that it wasn't just a one-off event in 2017. There were multiple times apparently when there were these late running kokanee. And in fact, the 2014 blueprint for kokanee restoration in Lake Sammamish even mentions these. I'll just read this in case it's a little small. It is unclear if the kokanee-like fish in the Sammamish River and its tributaries represent a separate kokanee population or residual sockeye salmon. So this idea was first that there was this weird population out there was around, and second, the lack of clarity about what they actually represented. Again, I think that it's fair to say the general view is that they're probably residuals. So I also noticed that, okay, 2011, 2017, that's kind of in multiples of 3 if I just ignore 2014. Kokanee often have a 3-year life cycle, at least that seems to be the biggest pulse. So I made some predictions, which I really call wishes more than predictions because I really had scant evidence on which to base them. But my thought was, well, maybe 2020 will be a strong year for these mystery Nurka, because 2017 was on the 3-year idea. My hope was that these mystery Nurka would be genetically distinct, so they wouldn't just be residuals, part of the introduced population of sockeye. And ideally, there'd be some evidence that they were native fish left over from the middle run. So it turns out that, yes, indeed, 2020 was a very strong year for mystery Nurka returning. I'm just going to play a little video here so you can kind of get a sense. This is drone footage that's taken near the mouth of Little Bear Creek in Woodinville. And this is just one small little section of it's quite a large area of all kokanee, mystery Nurka, whatever you'd like to call them, pairing with each other, spawning here. There's one sockeye in the mix here. So this is towards the end of the sockeye section, but it's almost all these kokanee and in really large numbers. So that's interesting.